The afternoon light flooded the glass-walled office with an almost deliberate cruelty, revealing every particle of dust suspended in the air. Ryan Anderson watched the 12th candidate of the day shift nervously in the chair across from his mahogany desk. She was talking about certifications in early childhood education, European cognitive development methodologies, and structured routines with military precision. He pretended to listen, but his eyes kept drifting to the Swiss clock on the wall. 20 more minutes, and he could end this awkward charade. The woman in front of him had all the credentials, a flawless resume, references from old-money New York families, impeccable posture. But Ryan knew with the bitter certainty of someone who had already been through this 11 times that she would last 3 weeks at most, maybe a month if she had the patience of a saint. The problem was never the nannies. The problem was Michael. His almost 2-year-old son lived like a ghost inside their Upper East Side mansion. He didn't cry, didn't laugh, didn't ask to be held. He just existed, with his enormous, empty brown eyes, observing the world as if from behind an impenetrable pane of glass. The doctors insisted there was nothing physically wrong. Neurologically perfect, they said. The problem was somewhere else in a hazy territory Ryan refused to explore because he knew exactly where he'd find the root of it all, in himself. The interview followed its predictable course. The candidate explained her approach to dealing with difficult children, a term she used as carefully as if she were walking on eggshells. Ryan nodded mechanically, already preparing his polite closing statement, when the office door opened with a soft creak. Helen, the housekeeper who had kept the house running for the last 15 years, appeared in the doorway, her apron immaculate, her expression apologetic. "I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. Anderson, but there's one more candidate waiting. She wasn't on the list, but she was very insistent and—" Helen hesitated, searching for the right words. "I thought you should at least meet her." Ryan suppressed a sigh. His patience for this process had run out hours ago, but Helen rarely made requests. If she thought it was worthwhile, there was probably something different about this young woman. "All right," he agreed, turning to the current candidate. "Thank you for your time. We'll be in touch." The woman left with the wounded dignity of someone who knows they won't be getting a call back. Ryan used the brief interval to pour himself a cup of now-cold coffee. He stared out the window at the meticulously manicured lawn where Michael never played. A swing set had been installed over a year ago, motionless as a decorative sculpture. The next candidate entered the office, bringing with her something Ryan couldn't immediately name. It wasn't expensive perfume or a practiced posture. It was something more subtle, a kind of lightness that contrasted with the heavy air of the house. She looked to be about 25, wearing a simple blouse and a denim skirt that hinted at a humble background. But she had a clarity in her eyes that made him involuntarily sit up straighter. Her brown hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she clutched a folder of documents with slightly trembling hands. "Good afternoon, my name is Julia Miller," she said, and her voice had a firmness that her hands didn't show. "I know I wasn't on the interview list, but when I heard about the opening from a friend at church, I felt like I had to try." Ryan gestured to the chair. Julia sat on the very edge, as if ready to bolt at any moment. He took the folder she held out and began flipping through it out of pure formality. A high school diploma, a basic first aid certification, 2 letters of recommendation from families he didn't know. "I see you don't have experience in homes on the Upper East Side," he commented, his tone not quite a criticism, but bordering on it. "No, sir. I worked for 3 years taking care of Mrs. Peterson's children in Flushing. After that, for a year, I helped at a community daycare center in Queens." She paused. "I know it's not what you're used to, but I'm a fast learner and I truly care about children." There was something disarming about her raw honesty. Ryan realized he was about to politely dismiss her when Julia leaned forward, completely ignoring the protocol that all the other candidates had followed to the letter. "May I ask a question?" she said, not quite waiting for permission. "Does your son like music?" Ryan blinked, thrown off by the abrupt change of direction. I don't know. I've never really paid attention." "And what does he play with? What are his favorite toys?" Ryan's throat tightened. It was a simple question, something any father should be able to answer without thinking. But he didn't know. He had no idea. "Michael doesn't play much," he answered, each word feeling like lead. "In fact, he doesn't do much of anything. He's a quiet child." Something flickered across Julia's face, an understanding that seemed to go beyond words. She opened her mouth to say something when the office door opened again. This time it was Jessica, the temporary nanny who was leaving that week, leading Michael by the hand. The little boy entered the room with his mechanical steps, his small, perfect body dressed in an expensive outfit that looked like a uniform. His angelic face was completely expressionless. He didn't look at his father, didn't show any curiosity about the stranger's presence. He simply stopped in the middle of the office, still as ever. Jessica mumbled something about needing to get her bags and quickly left. The silence that fell was absolute. Ryan felt the familiar weight of inadequacy crushing his chest. He never knew what to do in these moments, how to approach his own son, without it feeling like a corporate meeting between strangers. It was then that something happened that Ryan would forever remember as the instant everything changed. Julia rose slowly from her chair, crouching down until she was at Michael's eye level. She made no sudden moves, didn't try to touch him or force any interaction. She just stayed there on his line of sight, waiting. Michael turned his little head toward her. His eyes, those brown eyes Ryan had learned to fear for their absolute lack of life, landed on Julia's face, and something happened, something impossible and inexplicable. The boy's lower lip began to tremble, his eyebrows furrowed in an expression Ryan had never seen before. Michael took one step toward Julia, then another, and suddenly he was running on his short little legs, stumbling in his own haste. Julia received him naturally, wrapping her arms around him as he threw himself against her chest. And then Michael began to cry. It wasn't a hysterical or frightened cry. It was a deep, visceral sob, as if something that had been dammed up for his entire short life had finally found a crack to escape through. Ryan shot up from his chair so abruptly it nearly tipped over. He stood there, completely paralyzed, watching his son hug a complete stranger and cry in a way he had never cried in his arms. Julia stroked Michael's back with gentle movements, making a low, comforting sound. The boy clung to her with a strength disproportionate for his age, his little face buried in her shoulder. And then, muffled but unmistakable, came a sound that made Ryan feel as if the floor had been ripped out from under him. "Ma! Ma!" Michael's first word. It wasn't Daddy. It was a mumbled, desperate, and completely misplaced attempt to say Mama to a woman he had just met. Ryan didn't realize his eyes were welling up until a tear slid down his face. Julia looked at him over Michael's little head, and her eyes were shining too. But there was something there beyond the emotion of the moment. There was a silent question, a mute request for permission to continue being whatever she was being for this child. "You're hired," Ryan said, his voice coming out hoarse and broken. "When can you start?" Julia smiled through her own tears, still holding Michael, who was starting to calm down but refused to let her go. "I can start right now if you'll let me." And so it was on an ordinary Thursday afternoon that Julia Miller walked through the door of the Anderson mansion, not just as another employee, but as the only person in the world capable of reaching a child everyone else had given up on understanding. Julia's first night in the mansion unfolded like a delicate dance between the familiar and the unknown. Helen had prepared the nanny's room on the second floor, a simple but comfortable space overlooking the inner courtyard. Julia barely had time to unpack her small suitcase before Michael appeared at her door, brought by a visibly surprised Helen. "He snuck out of his room," the housekeeper explained, with a mix of astonishment and relief. "He was looking all over the house for you. I've never seen him do that before." Michael was clutching a worn blue blanket, the only object that seemed to hold any personal meaning for him. His eyes were fixed on Julia with an intensity that bordered on desperation. It was as if he feared that if he blinked, she might disappear like a dream. Julia knelt to his level again, a gesture that was already becoming natural between them. "Hi, Michael, did you come to visit me?" She held out her hand, and the boy took it immediately, his small fingers lacing through hers with force. "You know what I brought in my suitcase? A guitar. Would you like to hear a song before you go to sleep?" It was the first time anyone had asked Michael a direct question expecting a real answer. The boy didn't speak, but he nodded his head so slightly it could have been imagination. Julia, however, took it. Has the most meaningful communication in the world. She picked up the worn guitar that had belonged to her father, an instrument that had traveled all over the country before ending up in her hands. She sat on the bed and pulled Michael close. The boy settled against her side, still holding his blanket, but now with his eyes wide open and attentive. The first notes filled the room with a softness that seemed impossible in that house of straight lines and heavy silences. Julia sang an old folk song from the mountains of Pennsylvania, the kind her grandmother used to sing on warm nights in Harmony Creek. Her voice wasn't technically perfect, but it carried something more valuable: truth. Michael rested his head on her arm, and for the first time since he was born, he fell asleep without resistance, without that tense state of wakefulness that had worried all the doctors. What Julia didn't know was that Ryan was standing outside the room, having come up to check where Michael had gone. He stood there, leaning against the hallway wall, listening to that unfamiliar voice transform his house into something he couldn't name, something that felt dangerously like a home. When the music stopped, Ryan waited a few minutes before knocking lightly on the ajar door. Julia looked up, startled, and gestured to the sleeping Michael. "I'll take him to his room," Ryan whispered, entering carefully. "It's better to let him sleep here tonight," Julia replied softly. "He's so peaceful. We don't want to startle him now." Ryan hesitated. There was something deeply wrong about letting his son sleep in the nanny's room on her first night. But seeing Michael completely relaxed for the first time, one of his little hands still clutching Julia's shirt even in sleep, he couldn't argue. "All right, if you don't mind." "Of course I don't mind, Mr. Anderson." "Just Ryan is fine," he said, surprising himself. "The Mr. makes me feel like I'm 80. Julia smiled, and Ryan noticed it was a genuine smile, without the dose of polite falseness he received from practically everyone around him. He left the room but couldn't bring himself to go to his own. Instead, he went to his office and poured a scotch he didn't end up drinking. He stood there, looking out at the illuminated city through the window, thinking about how a house could be so full and so empty at the same time. The following days brought changes that started subtly, but soon became impossible to ignore. Julia established a routine that had nothing to do with the rigid schedules of the previous nannies. She would wake up with Michael at dawn and, instead of forcing him into a solitary breakfast in the kitchen, she would take him out to the still dewy lawn. Ryan, who used to leave the house before 7 without seeing his son, began to purposely delay his departure. From his bedroom window he would watch Julia and Michael, sitting on the grass, she pointing out the birds, he finally showing curiosity about the world around him. One morning, Ryan came downstairs earlier than usual and found them on the patio. Julia was teaching Michael to clap his hands to the rhythm of a song she was humming. The boy couldn't quite do it yet, his little hands meeting uncoordinatedly, but he was trying, and that was more than Ryan had gotten from him in almost 2 years. "Good morning," he said, and his own voice sounded strange and shy to his ears. Michael looked at him, and for the first time he didn't immediately look away. The boy studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide something important. "Say good morning to Daddy," Julia encouraged gently, without forcing it. Michael didn't say anything, but he nodded in Ryan's direction before turning his attention back to his attempt at clapping. It was small, but it was infinitely more than the emptiness before. Ryan felt a lump in his throat. He mumbled something about an urgent meeting and left for work, but he spent the entire day unable to concentrate on meetings and reports. His mind kept returning to that scene on the patio, to Julia's infinite patience, to the fact that his son was learning to exist in the world. That evening, for the first time in months, Ryan came home before 8. The mansion was different. There was soft instrumental music playing in the living room. Voices were coming from the kitchen, and Ryan found himself walking in that direction as if pulled by an invisible string. Julia was preparing Michael's dinner, talking to him about each ingredient as if the boy could answer. And maybe he could in his own way, because he was watching everything with an attention he had never shown before. "This is a carrot, Michael. Look at the pretty color. Orange like the sunset we saw today. Do you remember?" Michael picked up a piece of carrot and examined it, bringing it to his nose to smell. Julia laughed, a crystalline sound that made something stir in Ryan's chest. Exactly. Always smell your food first. My grandma always said we eat first with our eyes and nose, then with our mouths. It was then that Julia turned and saw Ryan standing in the kitchen doorway. She didn't seem embarrassed that he had found her there in her territory, treating the house as if it were her own. "Good evening, Ryan. You're home early." "I cancelled a meeting," he said, and it was true, though not the whole reason. The whole reason was that he couldn't stand being away anymore, couldn't stand missing the moments when his son was finally waking up to life. "Michael and I are making vegetable soup. Nothing too fancy, but—" She hesitated. "There's enough for 3 if you'd like to have dinner with us." It was a simple, almost casual invitation, but to Ryan it felt like the most significant thing anyone had offered him in years. He hadn't eaten dinner at home in so long, he couldn't even remember the last time. His meals were always at expensive restaurants with partners and clients, excellent food that tasted like nothing. "I'd like that very much," he replied, surprising them both. And so it was, in a kitchen illuminated by the warm light of the chandelier, that Ryan Anderson had dinner with his son for the first time. Julia served the soup in simple bowls, not the porcelain dishes that were kept in the cabinet. Michael ate slowly, but he ate. Every spoonful seemed like a small miracle. Ryan didn't know that the boy had been refusing solid food for weeks, that the previous nannies had to force-feed him bottles. "How do you do it?" Ryan asked, when Michael finished and Julia wiped his face with a gentleness that seemed second nature. "How do you reach him in a way no one else can?" Julia picked Michael up, the boy yawning and resting his head on her shoulder. She met Ryan's eyes, and in them was a wisdom that didn't match her age. "I don't do anything special. I pay attention to him, really pay attention, not to what he should be or what the books say a child his age needs to do. I pay attention to the Michael who is here, right now, with everything he is and everything he feels." Ryan felt as if she had just exposed all his failings as a father in a single gentle sentence. He looked down at the empty bowl in front of him. "I don't know how to do that," he admitted, his voice softer than he intended. "When I look at him, all I can see is—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't have to. Julia knew what he saw. He saw the absence. He saw the guilt. He saw the person who should have been there and wasn't anymore. "Then maybe it's time to learn to see differently," she said without judgment in her voice. "Michael doesn't need you to be perfect, Ryan. He just needs you to be here." Those words echoed in Ryan's mind long after Julia took Michael to bed, long after he retreated to his lonely room. For the first time in 2 years, he allowed himself to think that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to build something real with his son, and it was all because of a young woman who had walked into his life with nothing but an old guitar and a heart too big for her own good. The following week sketched out a new routine in the Anderson mansion, a silent choreography where each person learned their part. Ryan began leaving for the office later and coming home progressively earlier, always with a corporate excuse that sounded false even to him. The truth, which he barely admitted to himself, was that he no longer wanted to miss the moments when the house came to life. Julia transformed every room she passed through. The living room, once a museum of expensive, untouchable furniture, now had cushions scattered on the floor where she and Michael built towers with wooden blocks. The yard, that meticulously planned but sterile space, became a territory for exploration where the boy finally got dirty and seemed proud of it. One Saturday afternoon, Ryan made a decision that surprised even Helen. Instead of going to the office as he did every weekend, he stayed home. He came down to the kitchen in shorts and a t-shirt, something so unprecedented that the housekeeper almost dropped the tray of coffee she was carrying. "Mr. Anderson, do you need anything? I can prepare—" "It's all right, Helen. I just came for some coffee." He hesitated, hearing laughter coming from the yard. "Where are they?" "Miss Julia took little Michael out to play with the hose. She asked for permission first, of course, said the heat was unbearable." Ryan picked up his coffee cup and walked to the glass door that led to the yard. The scene he found made him stop in his tracks, unable to move. Julia had connected the garden hose and created a sort of makeshift sprinkler. She was completely soaked, her light dress clinging to her body, her hair dripping, laughing in a way so free it seemed impossible that sound could come from someone who worked for a living. And Michael, his Michael, was running under the water with a crystal-clear laugh, tripping over his own feet, getting up and running again. Ryan felt something break inside him. It was joy and pain at the same time, gratitude mixed with an envy. So intense it was physically painful. That should have been his wife out there playing with their son. That should have been the family he had dreamed of building. But it wasn't. And as much as it hurt to admit, Julia was doing something for Michael that he had never managed to do. She was teaching him that the world could be a place of joy. Michael saw his father at the door and stopped running. For a moment, Ryan feared his presence would ruin everything, that the boy would retreat into that empty shell from before. But then Julia turned, following Michael's gaze, and smiled. "Ryan, come play with us." It was a simple, almost childish invitation, but something in the way she said it, without hierarchy, without the formal weight of Mr. Anderson, made him find himself walking toward the yard before he had even processed the decision. "I don't have clothes to get wet," he started, but Julia was already aiming the hose at him. "Now you do!" The jet of water hit him full on, drenching his expensive t-shirt and making him gasp in surprise. For a second, Ryan just stood there, dripping, completely shocked. No one had dared to do something like that to him in how long he couldn't even remember. And then, to his own surprise and everyone else's, Ryan Anderson started to laugh. Not a polite, social gathering laugh, but a real belly laugh that came from some deep place he had forgotten existed. Michael looked at his father laughing, and something happened to the boy's face. It was like watching the sun rise, a gradual but undeniable change. He ran toward Ryan, not with fear or hesitation, but with open arms. Ryan caught him in midair, spinning with him, both of them laughing, both of them soaked, and for the first time since Michael was born, the boy hugged him back. Tiny arms around his neck, a laugh against his ear, and Ryan felt as if finally, something that was broken inside him was beginning to heal. Julia turned off the hose and watched them, discreetly wiping away her own tears. There was something about the scene that was both beautiful and painful, an intimacy she knew she could never truly claim. She was just the nanny, the temporary bridge between a father and a son. Eventually she would have fulfilled her role and could leave. Except the thought of leaving was starting to hurt in a way she wasn't prepared to face. That night, after Michael had fallen asleep, Ryan found Julia on the patio, looking out at the city lights. She had changed her clothes, but her hair was still damp, smelling of inexpensive shampoo and something floral he couldn't identify. "Thank you," he said, coming to sit beside her on the patio steps. "For what you did today. For everything you've been doing." Julia shrugged, but there was a sad smile on her face. "It's my job to take care of him. It's more than that, and you know it." Ryan turned to look at her directly. "You're changing his life. You're changing my life. This goes far beyond any job." There was a long silence. Julia hugged her knees, suddenly looking very young and very vulnerable. "Can I tell you something?" she said finally. "Michael reminds me of my little brother, Ben. He was like that when he was little, full of life, always laughing. I used to take care of him while my mom worked." She paused, and Ryan sensed there was pain in that memory. Used. "Too? He lives with my aunt now back home. When my mom got sick, I couldn't take care of both of them by myself. He was still so little. He needed attention I couldn't give him while I was working. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, letting him go." Ryan felt his chest tighten. Suddenly, a lot about Julia made sense. The way she devoted herself completely to Michael, as if every moment mattered. The sadness that sometimes passed through her eyes when she thought no one was looking. "I'm sorry," he said, and the two words were insufficient for the pain he saw in her. "That's life, right? You do what you can with what you've got." Julia quickly wiped her eyes. "But taking care of Michael, it makes me feel like I can still make a difference, that I can still be that person who cares, who protects. It makes my heart ache a little less." Ryan didn't think about what he did next. He simply reached out and pulled Julia closer, letting her rest her head on his shoulder. It was inappropriate, probably crossing some invisible line between employer and employee. But in that moment, He didn't care about lines or protocols. She needed comfort, and he needed to offer it to someone who had given him so much. They stayed like that for a long time, two wounded human beings finding a moment of peace in each other's company. Above them, the stars bore silent witness, and inside the house, Michael slept peacefully for the first time in his life, unaware of the delicate web of affection and need being woven around him. What neither of them knew was that this moment of closeness, so innocent and necessary, marked the beginning of something neither Ryan nor Julia was prepared to face, something that would completely transform not only the relationship between them, but the entire future they had imagined for themselves. Inside the house, Helen watched from the kitchen window and shook her head slightly. She had seen many things in her 15 years working for the Anderson family, but this fragile and dangerous connection forming between her boss and the young nanny, this was something new, and she didn't know whether to pray for it to blossom or for it to end before someone got truly hurt. Because in her experience, when worlds so different collided, it rarely ended well for the hearts involved. October arrived, bringing the first spring rains that washed over New York City with a melancholy persistence that made the city feel more human. Ryan was in his office, pretending to analyze financial reports while actually watching the rain blur the garden into an impressionist painting. His phone rang, displaying Helen's number. He answered distractedly, expecting some routine household question. "Mr. Anderson, I'm sorry to bother you at work, but..." The housekeeper's voice had an unusual urgency. "It's little Michael. He has a high fever. Can't Miss Julia is very worried. I've given him the medicine, but maybe you should come home." Ryan was on his feet before Helen even finished the sentence. He grabbed his jacket, mumbled something to his assistant about a family emergency, and left, leaving a conference room full of surprised executives staring at the closed door. The traffic on Park Avenue was impossible with the rain, each minute feeling like an hour. Ryan drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, trying not to let his anxiety turn into panic. It was just a fever. Kids got fevers all the time. But Michael wasn't just any kid. He was his son, and the thought of something happening to him made his chest tighten in a way he wasn't prepared to feel. When he finally got home, he found Julia in the living room with Michael in her arms, rocking him gently while humming softly. The boy was visibly listless, his cheeks flushed, his eyes bright with fever. "How is he?" Ryan asked, dropping his wet briefcase on the floor and kneeling beside them. "The fever went down a little after the medicine, but he won't let go of me." Julia stroked Michael's sweaty hair. "I think it's just a virus, but he's so scared. He's never been sick since I got here." Michael opened his eyes at the sound of his father's voice. He reached a trembling little hand toward Ryan, and the gesture was so unexpected and so longed for that Ryan felt his eyes burn. "Do you want to go with Daddy?" Julia asked softly. To both their surprise, Michael nodded yes. Julia carefully transferred him into Ryan's arms, and the boy nestled against his father's chest with the same trust he showed her. It was the first time. This had happened, the first time Michael had actively chosen him. "I'm here, champ," Ryan murmured against his son's hair. "Daddy's here, and I won't let anything bad happen to you." Julia smiled through her own tears. "I'll get a cold compress. Keep doing that. He's calming down." The next few hours dissolved into a shared vigil. Ryan and Julia took turns holding Michael, taking his temperature, offering water and words of comfort. The fever rose and fell in unpredictable waves, making the boy slightly delirious at times, calling out for both of them in ways that melted any defenses they might have had. It was during one of those long pre-dawn hours, with Michael finally sleeping more peacefully between them on the sofa, that Ryan broke the silence. "When he was born," he began, his voice low and heavy, "the nurse put him in my arms, and all I could think was that he was stained with my wife's blood. I know that sounds terrible to say, but it was all I could see. I couldn't look at my son without seeing what had been taken from me." Julia said nothing, just placed her hand over his in a silent offer of support. "Isabella and I didn't have a perfect marriage," Ryan continued, the words tumbling out as if they'd been trapped for a long time. "In fact, it was far from perfect. But there was love, or at least there was mutual respect and companionship. When she got pregnant, I thought it might fix the things that were broken between us. Instead, he didn't need to finish. Julia knew the end of that story. It's not Michael's fault, she said gently, and deep down, you've always known that. That's why you never mistreated or neglected him. You always made sure he had everything he needed materially. Except the only thing that really matters, Ryan replied, squeezing her hand. Except my love. Except my real presence. Until you came and showed me what I was missing, the incredible son who was growing up in front of me, while I insisted on not seeing. You're seeing now, Julia said. That's what matters. Michael is still so little. You have a whole life ahead of you to build that bond. Ryan looked at her in the dim light of the room, illuminated only by the soft glow of a lamp. There was something in the way Julia held his hand, in the forced intimacy of that shared moment of vulnerability, that made his heart race in a way that had nothing to do with fatherly concern. How are you so wise for someone so young? He asked, and his voice came out lower, more intimate than he intended. Julia gave a sad smile. Pain is a fast teacher. When you have to grow up quickly to take care of the people you love, you don't have much time to be young and foolish. There were so many questions Ryan wanted to ask, about the sick mother she had mentioned, about the brother she had to let go, about the dreams she had probably abandoned to take on such heavy responsibilities. But Michael stirred between them, murmuring something unintelligible in his sleep, and the moment broke. He's better, Julia said, checking the boy's forehead with her lips. The fever's down. I think the worst is over. Thanks to you, Ryan said. I would have panicked if I were alone. You would have done fine, she assured him. You do better than you think, Ryan. You just need to trust yourself a little more. They carried Michael back to his own bed, something that hadn't happened since Julia arrived. The boy had slept more nights in her room than his own. But that night, he settled into his bed without protest, holding both of their hands until he fell completely asleep. Ryan and Julia stood there for a long moment, watching the boy sleep, neither wanting to be the first to pull away. Julia, Ryan began, turning to her, his voice hesitant. I need to tell you something that... His phone rang, far too loud in the silence of the room. Michael stirred, but didn't wake. Ryan cursed under his breath, grabbing the device. It was his business partner calling about a crisis with a major client. I have to take this, he said reluctantly, but after, we need to talk. Julia nodded, but there was something in her face that wasn't there before. A wariness, perhaps a premonition of what he was about to say, and all the complications that would come with it. Ryan left the room, answering the call, leaving Julia alone with her thoughts. She sat in the chair beside Michael's bed, watching the boy's chest rise and fall. Rhythmically, she knew what was happening. She wasn't foolish or naive. She had noticed the subtle shifts in the way Ryan looked at her, the way he found reasons to be near, how their conversations had evolved from polite exchanges to something much deeper and more personal. And the terrible truth she was desperately trying to deny was that she felt the same way. Somewhere between teaching Michael to laugh and watching Ryan learn to be a father, she had crossed an invisible line. She had stopped seeing a rich, distant boss and started seeing just Ryan, a wounded man, trying to piece his life back together, a father learning to love, a lonely soul seeking connection in a world that had taken so much from him. But that didn't change the facts. She was the nanny, he was the millionaire. She came from Harmony Creek, from a humble house where sometimes there wasn't enough food at the end of the month. He came from a line of New York businessmen, from a world where people had last names that opened doors and stories published in society columns. And more importantly, she was there to help Michael, not to further complicate the life of this already broken family. Julia stood up, placed one last kiss on Michael's forehead, and quietly left the room. She needed to create distance, needed to remember her place before she did something stupid, like believe that stories like hers had happy endings. But as she passed through the hallway, she couldn't help but overhear Ryan's voice on the phone, tense and frustrated, as he dealt with corporate problems that seemed so empty compared to what they had shared that night. And a treacherous part of her heart whispered that maybe, just maybe, some lines were meant to be crossed. November arrived, bringing the characteristic heat that turned New York City into an urban greenhouse. The Anderson mansion, with its powerful air conditioning, remained an oasis of controlled temperature, but another kind of heat was growing inside, one that no cooling system could dissipate. Ryan was in his office trying to focus on a merger proposal when he heard the house phone ring. Helen answered, and even through the walls, he could hear the worried tone in her voice. Moments later, she knocked on his door. "Mr. Anderson, I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's urgent. Miss Julia got a call from Harmony Creek about her mother." Ryan felt his stomach drop. He let his pen fall and practically ran to the living room, where he found Julia sitting on the sofa, the phone still in her trembling hand, her face completely white. "Julia, what happened?" She looked at him but seemed to be seeing right through him, in a state of shock. "It's my mom. The tumor is back. They say she needs surgery immediately, but it's complex, expensive. Without it," her voice broke, "without it, I'm going to lose my mom." "Ryan." He sat beside her, taking her cold hands in his. "How much? How much is the surgery?" Julia mentioned a figure that to Ryan was insignificant, the equivalent of a corporate dinner for 10. But he could see in her face that the number represented something impossible, an insurmountable mountain between her mother and life. "I'll pay for it," he said immediately. "Don't argue with me. I'll transfer the money right now." "Which hospital?" But Julia was already shaking her head, pulling her hands from his. "No, I can't accept that. Julia, be reasonable. Your mother needs—" "I know. What my mother needs." Her voice was louder than she intended, and she stood up abruptly, walking to the window. "But I can't just take your money. Don't you get it? People will think— they'll say I took advantage of you, that I planned all this, that—" "Who cares what people will say?" Ryan stood up too, following her. "We're talking about your mother's life. And my dignity." Julia turned to him, tears now streaming freely. "You don't understand because you've never had to choose between accepting charity and keeping your honor. You've never had to live knowing that people look at you and just see someone second class, someone who needs favors to survive." Ryan fell silent because she was right. He didn't understand, not really. But he saw her pain, saw her wounded pride fighting against her desperation, and his heart broke. "Then tell me what to do," he said gently. "Tell me how I can help in a way you can accept." Julia angrily wiped her tears, as if she were mad at herself for showing weakness. "There is no way. I'm going to have to go home. I'll take care of her in the time she has left. At least I can give her that." "You're going to quit?" It wasn't a question. "I have no choice, Ryan." "And Michael?" The question came out harsher than he intended. "You're just going to abandon him?" Julia staggered, as if she'd been physically struck. "That's not fair. You know I love that boy like he's my own." "Then stay. Let me help your mother. Let me make a difference in the life of someone who means so much to you." "And then what? Then I'm indebted to you forever? I'm stuck here not by choice but by obligation." Julia shook her head. "That's not how I want to live my life." It was in that moment that Ryan finally understood. It wasn't just about money or pride. It was about everything that had grown between them in the past weeks. All the unspoken tension, all the glances that lasted a second too long, all the times their hands had brushed and neither had pulled away immediately. Julia was afraid of being trapped not just by financial gratitude, but by something far more dangerous and confusing that neither of them was ready to name. "Julia," he said softly, taking a step toward her. "This has nothing to do with you owing me anything." "No," she laughed humorlessly. "Then why do you want to help me so badly, Ryan? Why does it matter so much to you?" It was the question he had been avoiding asking himself for weeks. And suddenly, standing there in front of her, seeing the tears on her face and the fear in her eyes, he could no longer run from the answer. "Because I've fallen in love with you," he said, and the words came out easier than he'd imagined. "I don't know exactly when. It happened. Maybe that first day when you took Michael in your arms and he cried for the first time. Maybe that night we cooked together and you made me laugh for the first time in years. Or maybe it was gradual, one moment after another, Until one day I woke up and realized I don't want to live in a world where you're not." Julia froze, processing his words. When she finally spoke, her voice was a broken whisper. "You can't say things like that." "Why not? They're true." "Because you're my boss, Ryan, because I'm your son's nanny. Because we live in completely different worlds and this will never work." "You feel the same way," he said, and it wasn't a question. "I see it in your eyes, Julia, in the way you look at me when you think I'm not watching, in the way your breath catches when I'm close. It doesn't matter what I feel." She looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "Even if I did feel something, and I'm not saying I do, it would only make everything more complicated. I can't accept your money now, Ryan. People will think I seduced you. For it, that I planned this from the beginning. To hell with people. Easy for you to say when you're who you are, hard to live with when you're who I am." Julia grabbed her purse from a chair. "I'm going to pack my things. I'm taking the bus to Harmony Creek tonight. Julia, please, tell Michael thank you for me. Tell him I had to leave, but that I'll never forget him." She practically ran out of the room, leaving Ryan standing there, feeling as if the floor had been ripped out from under his feet. He had just confessed something he barely admitted to himself, and she had run away. But it was her pride that had run, Ryan realized. It was the fear of being seen as an opportunist, of her genuine feelings being tainted by financial circumstances. And he didn't know how to fix it, how to make her see that the money was the smallest part of what he was offering. That night, when Michael woke up and looked for Julia, Ryan had to sit with his son and explain that she had to go away to take care of her family. The boy didn't cry right away. He just looked at his father with those enormous eyes and said the word that broke Ryan's heart into 1,000 pieces. "Mama?" "She's not your mama, champ," Ryan explained gently, picking Michael up. "But she loves you very much. And she's going to come back. I promise she'll come back." It was a promise he didn't know if he could keep. But looking at the son Julia had helped save, Ryan knew he would do anything, absolutely anything, to bring back the woman who had turned his cold house into a home. Even if it meant going to Harmony Creek, Pennsylvania, and begging on his knees if he had to. Because some people are worth any sacrifice of pride, and Julia Miller was definitely one of them. The next 3 days were the longest of Ryan Anderson's life. Michael regressed drastically without Julia's presence, returning to the state of apathy that had terrified Ryan in the boy's first months. He wouldn't eat properly, wouldn't play, just sat in her room holding the guitar she had left behind. Ryan tried everything. He hired a temporary nanny whom Michael completely ignored. He tried to play, to sing, to do everything he had seen Julia do. But it was like trying to reproduce magic without understanding the trick. It didn't work when it was him, because it wasn't about the actions themselves. It was about the person doing them. It was about Julia. On the 3rd night after Michael finally fell asleep after hours of silent, devastating crying, Ryan made a decision. He went into his office, picked up the phone, and called his partner. "Mark, I need you to cover my appointments for the next few days, maybe a week." "Ryan, we're in the middle of a major merger. You can't just—" "I can and I will," Ryan interrupted, surprised by his own firmness. "There are more important things than business, Mark. It took me too long to understand that. But I finally get it." He hung up before his partner could argue, went to Michael's room and picked up the sleeping boy, wrapping him in blankets. Helen appeared at the door, startled. "Mr. Anderson, what are you doing?" "I'm going to get the person who's supposed to be here," he answered simply. "Can you look after the house while I'm gone?" Helen smiled, and there were tears in her eyes. "Go get our girl, Mr. Anderson, and this time don't let either of your prides get in the way." The drive to Harmony Creek took 8 hours, through the night and into the dawn. Michael woke up confused in his car seat, but when Ryan explained where they were going, the boy's little face lit up in a way that made every mile worth it. "Mama?" Michael asked hopefully. "We're going to see Julia," Ryan corrected gently, but his heart ached. Michael had started calling Julia that, and though Ryan knew it was technically wrong, he couldn't bring himself to truly correct him, because in his heart, where it mattered, Julia was the mother Michael had chosen. They arrived in Harmony Creek when the sun was already high, turning the historic stone streets into a postcard. Ryan stopped to ask for directions and was pointed toward a simple house on the outskirts of town, far from the colonial mansions of the tourist center. The house was small but well kept, with flower boxes in the windows and a wooden door painted light blue. Ryan took a deep breath, picked Michael up, and knocked. Woman in her 50s answered, thin and visibly weakened by illness, but with the same kind eyes as Julia. "Can I help you?" she asked, and then she saw Michael. Her face lit up. "Oh, you must be little Michael. My daughter never stops talking about you. Mrs. Miller, my name is Ryan Anderson. I need to speak with Julia." Julia's mother studied Ryan with an intensity that made him feel as if he were being judged not by his bank account, but by the content of his character. Finally, she opened the door completely. "She's in the backyard, but I think I'd better take you. Julia's been difficult these last few days." Ryan entered the modest home, so different from his mansion, but infinitely more welcoming. There were photos on the walls, handmade doilies covering the furniture, the smell of home cooking coming from the kitchen. In the small backyard, Julia was hanging clothes on a line. She wore a simple cotton dress, and her hair was in a messy bun. She looked younger this way, more vulnerable, and Ryan's heart ached seeing her. Michael saw Julia and began to struggle in Ryan's arms, shouting, "Mama! Mama!" with all the force of his little lungs. Julia spun around so abruptly, she knocked over the laundry basket. Her face went through a sequence of emotions, shock, joy, confusion, and finally, something that looked like fear. "Ryan? What are you doing here?" But Michael had already been set down and was running toward her with that uncoordinated speed of a small child. Julia caught him automatically, and the boy clung to her as if his life depended on it, sobbing into her neck. "Missed you, missed you, missed you," he repeated between sobs, words he had never said before that he might not have even known he knew until that moment. "I missed you too, my love," Julia whispered, tears streaming freely down her face. "So much." Ryan approached slowly, as if nearing something fragile that might break. Julia's mother had discreetly gone back inside, giving them privacy. "He's not eating," Ryan said, his voice hoarse. "He's not sleeping right. He just sits in your room, waiting for you to come back. And He stopped, swallowing hard. "I've discovered I'm exactly the same. The house is empty without you, Julia. We're empty." "Ryan, I already explained why I can't—" she began, but he cut her off. "I know. You explained about pride, about dignity, about not wanting to owe anyone anything. And I respect that. I respect you. But Julia, what I'm offering isn't charity. It's... He searched for the right words, knowing this was the most important moment of his life, that what he said now would determine everything else. "It's love," he said finally, with absolute simplicity. "It's pure and simple love. Not the kind that comes with conditions or expectations. Not the kind that expects to be paid back. It's the kind of love that just wants to see the person you love happy and safe and alive." Julia held Michael to her chest, the tears falling non-stop now. "But people will think—" "Julia Miller," came her mother's firm voice from the kitchen window. "Get in here, now." Julia obeyed automatically, still carrying Michael, with Ryan following hesitantly. Inside the simple kitchen, Julia's mother was sitting at the worn wooden table, and there was a glint in her eye that was part amusement, part maternal exasperation. "Sit down, girl," she ordered, pointing to the chair opposite her. Julia sat, with Michael still glued to her. Her mother turned to Ryan. "You too, young man, sit." Ryan sat, feeling strangely like he was in the principal's office. "Julia," her mother began, "you're my daughter and I love you more than anything in this world, but you are being a fool." "Mum, let me finish. This man drove all night with a child to come get you. This child," she pointed to Michael, "calls you Mama. You think that's nothing. You think true love comes around so often that you can afford to send it away because of what some gossiping neighbors might think? But the money, the treatment, take the treatment, let the man help. And then if your pride can't handle it, you pay him back slowly, however you can. But don't you throw away a chance to be happy, to have a family because of stupid pride." Julia's mother turned to Ryan. "And you, rich man, do you love my daughter?" "I do," Ryan answered without hesitation. "With everything I am." "And you'll treat her with respect. You won't think that, just because you have more money, you can boss her around?" "Never. Julia is the strongest person I know. She doesn't need someone bossing her around. She needs a partner, and I very much want to be that partner." Julia's mother nodded, satisfied. "Then it's settled. You accept the help, girl. Let the man pay for my treatment. And then the three of you go and build a real family, the kind that matters." Julia looked at her mother, then at Ryan, then at Michael nestled in her arms. And finally, the walls she had built began to crumble. "Promise it's not pity?" she asked Ryan, her voice small. "Promise it's real?" Ryan stood up and knelt beside her chair, taking her, free hand while her other held Michael. "Julia Miller, you brought light into my life when everything was darkness. You taught me how to be a father. You taught me how to feel again. You taught me that it's worth trying, even when everything seems too broken to fix. I'm not offering you money, Julia. I'm offering you my heart, my life, a future where we build something beautiful together. You, me, and Michael. A real family." He took something from his pocket, a small velvet box he had bought on the drive. Inside was a simple white gold ring with a discreet diamond. "Marry me. Not as my employee, not as my son's nanny. Marry me as my partner, my equal, the woman I love and want by my side forever." Julia sobbed, laughing and crying at the same time. "This is crazy. We've known each other for less than 3 months. And I've lived more in these 3 months than in the last 3 years, Ryan replied. "So? Are you going to let me spend the rest of my life proving you made the right choice?" Julia looked at Michael, who had stopped crying and was now watching them with those big, intelligent eyes. The boy took her free hand and placed it on top of Ryan's hand that held the ring. "Mama, Daddy," he said clearly, joining their hands. It was that simple gesture, that childish yet profound understanding of how things should be, that broke Julia's last resistance. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." Ryan slipped the ring on her finger and then pulled her in for a kiss, careful and reverent, sealing a promise that went far beyond words. Michael, squeezed between them, let out a crystal-clear giggle that filled the entire kitchen. When they parted, both laughing through their tears, Michael touched Ryan's face with one small hand. "Daddy," he said with absolute clarity, the first time he had truly used that word. Then he turned to Julia, "Mama." And in that moment, in a humble kitchen in Harmony Creek, a new family was born. Not a perfect family, because perfection doesn't exist, but a real family, built on chosen love, on shared healing, on the courage to believe that the future can be better than the past. Ryan arranged for Mrs. Miller's treatment immediately, and the surgery was a complete success. 3 months later, in an intimate ceremony at the same Harmony Creek church where Julia had been baptized, Ryan and Julia were married. Michael was the ring bearer, carrying the rings with a comical seriousness for a 2.5-year-old. The mansion in New York was transformed. Julia filled the empty rooms with life. She brought her brother Ben to live with them, settled her mother in a comfortable guest house in the garden, filled the walls with photos and the shelves with books, and replaced the silence with music and laughter. And Ryan, the man who had learned that wealth without love was just a gilded cage, discovered that the best thing his money could buy was the chance to love without fear. Years later, when someone asked how they had met, Michael, now a smart and loving 6-year-old, would answer with the simple wisdom of children. "Daddy was lost and Mommy found him, and then they found me, and now nobody's lost anymore." And that, in the end, was the simplest and most profound truth. Sometimes the right people walk into our lives at the exact moment we need them most. And when we recognize that gift, when we have the courage to grab on with both hands and never let go, miracles happen. Miracles that look a lot like love, family, and finally being home. End of story. If the journey of Ryan, Julia, and Michael warmed your heart, we have many more emotional stories waiting for you. Each narrative is crafted with care to touch your soul and make you believe in the transformative power of true love. Hit the like button if this story moved you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new stories, and let us know in the comments. Do you believe love can overcome all differences? Your opinion is very important to us. Until the next story.